We're going to really dive in today on the topic of discipline.
Your questions are being answered today on Family Vision.
Hi, my name is Rienow. Welcome to Family Vision with my parents, Dr. Rob and Amy Rienow, strengthening families through practical, encouraging, and real conversations.
Hello, this is Amy Rienow, and I am here in the studio today with my daughter, Lissy Bailey.
Hi, it's really good to be back on the podcast today. It's been a while.
Yeah, we just got done with a great mother-daughter event this week, which kind of led to the next few podcasts that we are going to be doing. While it's not exclusively about mother and daughters, because we're just going to be hitting on some basic parenting questions, but as a result of that event, we were thinking about getting questions from our audience about what people wanted to hear on the podcast, and we got how many questions, Liz?
We got a lot. So we put out a couple social media posts, and I actually think this is funny because I have so many friends who are in this sort of season of new motherhood, whether it be baby or toddler, or if they have some older kids, who have literally been asking me, like, can your mom talk about these things? Or like, we just want to learn from your mom. And I feel like I'm right there with them because, so I have a 2-year-old and a 10-month-old, and it's just hard as a new mom because I feel like there's so many things you just don't know what you don't know. And so getting wisdom from people who have gone through this process, and then obviously you, I also tell my friends, you know, my mom has this amazing memory when it comes to raising kids. Like, I feel like you remember so much about the baby phase, the toddler phase, older kids. And so we're just really excited to sit down and talk about some of these questions because you have obviously a lot of experience after doing it 7 times.
I love hearing about the conversations with your friends. But before we get going on this, it actually reminded me, you and I are just like this. The train is leaving the station. That's how motherhood is. Like, you are on that train and you're trying to figure out what you're doing, but the train is going to keep going no matter what. So we are about to enter these 3 podcasts that we are going to do. We're going to hit a lot of these questions. And frankly, we probably won't even get to all those questions in these 3 podcasts. And we will be focusing on these first 3 on kind of those younger stages that you were talking about. But before we get this ball completely rolling, that no pun intended, but I wanted to talk about the Thanksgiving ball that's coming up on November 10th at the Abington in Glen Ellen. This is a fantastic event for families with kids of all ages, but I want to encourage you and your friends, of course, to put that on your calendar and to check that out at visionaryfam.com. You will find it comes up right away, a banner for the Thanksgiving ball. So do not miss it. But now Lissy is going to lead us into this podcast with the first of many questions.
Yes, we're excited to kind of dive into these. And we are really excited to be at the ball this fall. Our daughter had the best time last year, so she is ready to go for the Thanksgiving ball. So this first kind of episode, we tried to break these questions up into a few different topics. So we're going to really dive in today on the topic of discipline. And I think that this is hard because there's so much out there, especially on social media, on whether it's gentle parenting or you should do this with your toddler. I just think it's sort of an issue that people have really strong opinions about. And really, it's hard to navigate when you're in the thick of it and issues start arising. And it can happen pretty early.
Yes.
So this first question is, can you just walk us through some guidelines when it comes to discipline? And how do you know what is age appropriate? And when does that even official term discipline start in your mind?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I have, of course, a lot of stories to go with that question because there's always a new parenting discipline mindset out there. And let me begin where I started first with my kids, which was at the time 3-2-1 Magic was the popular book. So that whole point was, 1, 2, you give a child to 3 as you give them a command, and some major thing was going to happen after you hit 3. But the goal of the parenting was that you would never get to 3. You know what I mean? So I'd be like, W, you need to put that toy down. Okay, 1, 2. That was the typical. That was the modern one, and I did that for like the first 5 years until the Lord kind of shifted me. But I want to first address, well, wait, let me go back. The other one that was super popular and I think still is Growing Kids God's Way by Ezzo. That was a very popular one as well. Now, I had not done a deep dive myself, but I'd been around a lot of parents who were using Ezzo. And let me just tell you the things that really struck me again after having, I think I started to learn this after 4 kids. So here's just a good example that you do not figure everything out right away. It is a process. So the first thing I want to say to moms is you'll give yourself some grace in this discipline process because it is a process you're supposed to be learning. You don't have to have everything perfect. Mm-hmm. But what I did begin to see that there was a real difference between what I would call managing behavior and true discipline. Basically, between 0 to the age 3, even though, yes, your child can defy you and you need to figure out what is a timeout or am I going to use spanking, there's all those questions, but you are truly managing their behavior in the sense that so many of the things your children are doing at that point are reactionary and not necessarily willful. After 3, you can begin to discipline in such a way where you can see that your kids understand that they have disobeyed you. That I call the discipline phase. Like you really are doing discipline and discipleship. And you can actually share the gospel with a 3-year-old because they begin to understand that mom gave them a choice. They chose to disobey, and they feel this guilt and burden by that. And honestly, it's not just, they turn 3 and it's a magic. Maybe for some kids it's a little before age 3. Others it's the same after. But whatever is going on developmentally there, they're starting to connect choices. And I do see a lot of people attributing character qualities on little ones way too early. Mm-hmm. So when you've got a child that is very reactionary and you call them defiant issues.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It seems like parents sometimes are really eager to jump the gun on labeling
Correct.
what their kids are kind of struggling with or dealing with, like, oh, my child is so disobedient, or they talk back, or they, whatever it is. But it does feel like, and I think it's hard. I experienced this with my first. You expect them to sort of be older than they really are because
Correct.
I have a baby. And so I think I oftentimes view my oldest as being further along when really she's not there yet. And I love, you tell me this all the time, but this idea of their babies till they're 3. Can you just touch on that really quick?
Yeah, that was given to me by a nurse when I left the hospital, I think with JD, so my third. She just said that to me in passing, just remember, Mom, their babies till they're 3. And it was so helpful. I held on to that because I realized that especially when you were born and RW was 2, again, those expectations went up for how he should behave. And I think I put more things on him. And also, I think you parent a lot your first by what you got from your parenting. So I come from a family that had definite attributing like character traits to. So let me just say I'll give you the story from my family. I was always viewed as the compliant baby that you just looked at me, like they never had to spank me, never had to discipline me because I was very sensitive. In contrast, they always tell the story about my brother who would go after an outlet repeatedly and they would slap his hand and he would just keep doing it and keep doing it. He was labeled very early as pretty strong-willed and defiant. I realized later that it could just be that my brother had a really high pain tolerance. Like slapping his hand just didn't mean anything to him. And so therefore, all of a sudden, he's getting this attribution of his character as strong-willed and defiant over, like I would say, the way he's wired and more a sensory thing. So when you get to a certain point, a kid will, choose. Like they will know, Mom says to do this, but I'm going to do this. And that's when they can feel guilt. That's why you can explain, here's a key point that I make. You can explain the gospel to your 3-year-old. And they will begin to understand when you're doing that in the discipline process, when they've known the difference between choosing right and wrong versus just that reactionary response.
Yes, and I think some of the best advice you even gave me, because we tend to use this word discipline, but really one of the most important things that you can start with your, say, 1-year-old or 18-month-old or 2-year-old is listening when it comes to danger. And that was the best advice you gave me, is that it's not even discipline necessarily, but it's making sure that your child will listen to you when there is a dangerous situation. Correct. So can you talk about that really quickly?
Yes, because it is important in these years to keep your children safe, and it is important to manage their behavior. So I'm not saying that all those things are important before 3. They're extremely important. And what your job is as a parent is to set up boundaries around your little ones that they can be successful in. One of the most important boundaries you want to set up is the distinction between the word no and danger. Because as a mom, you are going to be saying no to many things. And no is going to be something that obviously they need to understand. But I would use a different word when they were doing something that was extremely dangerous. Like if they start running toward the street, I would go, danger, danger. So they knew a distinction. That's important because you want to be giving them cues that they can understand at that age, that there's a big difference between a no and what is dangerous for you.
Right.
But it's also important as a parent. I see this all the time in culture today. And there's actually so much to talk about this. I feel like we're not going to get through one question. But the narcissism that is in our culture can be really evident in these early years. A lot of parents feel they've accomplished some significant battle if, for example, they've trained their kids at a young age not to go near the stairs, let's say. Well, I've already trained them. I'm not going to go near to know the show. I don't need a gate on that stairs because I know that my kid is really good at listening to me and they won't do that. This is such a sad story, but this breaks my heart every time. But I heard a story recently where a 4-year-old child had been trained to not go near a pool in the backyard. So there weren't really safety things. There was the confidence that this child knew, that they shouldn't go near the pool. Mm-hmm. Well, he went in to change the baby's diaper, felt the 4-year-old would not go in the pool. The 4-year-old went in the pool. Mm-hmm. It did not have a good outcome. But you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
The point is, the guidelines you're putting up for your kids, you as the parent need to set successful boundaries so your kids can have success in those boundaries you're setting. So even if you've trained your kid, for example, not to go near the stairs, you put a gate up. You know what I mean?
Right.
You don't count on that before the age of 4. Comes with this sort of pride, like my child would never do that. Well, that's not a great way of thinking.
Totally. And let's move along those same lines. This is a great question. So someone asked, toddler tantrums. How do you handle them? Gentle parenting is what we try to practice at home, but I feel like it can seem too passive at times. We are struggling with toddler defiance and obeying. Obviously, a big piece of this is the developmental stage they are in, but it is hard. I relate.
It is
so
hard.
Can you talk about toddler tantrums?
It was interesting that you told this term gentle parenting. Can you explain that?
Yeah, and I might not do the best job at explaining this, but I think that there is sort of a big push for gentle parenting right now as a reactionary response to what may have been a more authoritarian parenting that millennials experience. So it's really popular among millennials who maybe had really strict authoritarian parents who would do a lot of discipline or maybe spank or whatever you would want to call that. And so gentle parenting is almost like going to the opposite extreme, in my opinion, where everything is about the feelings of the child, explaining to them how they're making other children feel, how it makes mommy feel when you yell. It's very much centered around preserving kind of the feelings and the emotional well-being of the child.
So the specific question is toddler tantrums. How do you handle them? Wow. There are many ways to handle a toddler tantrum, and it depends on your child the best way to handle a toddler tantrum. Toddlers need, in general, these 2 words go together. I say this to you. They need firm boundaries and love and commitment. Firm boundaries, love, and commitment. So a lot of parents actually make the mistake of kind of going on one side or the other. Does that make sense? They might do a lot of firmness without a lot of affection and love. So that leaves them feeling probably the way you're talking about the millennials were feeling.
Right.
Whereas other parents will go with the love and nurturing without the firm boundaries, And that's not actually helpful for them at all.
Right.
It's actually doing them a disservice. The many ways I dealt with the toddler tantrum, one of you keeps, in my mind, comes up so clear. You were 2. We were at Disney World at the Fort Wilderness restaurant. We were on a youth group trip. You were so upset about something. I don't remember what it was. And we just watched you at the entrance and families walk around you as you rolled around on the ground with your defiance of wanting whatever it is you wanted. And, we just sat there and watched you, and let you do that. In that setting, it was fine to let you have your little tantrum there. And I was just basically like, are you done now, Lissy? You know what I mean? And then just picked you up and loved you afterwards, did not give in to what you wanted.
Right.
So that you got to see that you could behave that way and it produced no positive result for you. But I didn't punish you relationally. I didn't shun you, or I'm not saying I never did that. Parents make mistakes. You can get really angry and be like, I can't handle it. That's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. You have to go around and reconcile the relationship, even with a toddler.
Right.
Toddlers can feel that. But I do remember that being a victory because I wasn't upset at you. We were just sort of humorously laughing at you. Like, are we going to, how many families have to walk around our little toddler just, running? But other things we tried, we'd put them in the crib. If you had a toddler tantrum, we would do the timeout where we faced the timeout chair to the wall and you had to put your forehead on the wall.
That's what we do with AV right now. It's really
with the nose on the wall. And, they're just like this, and they're so upset. But those kind of things were helpful. Putting the toy in timeout, that would be one of my big techniques of, if you're going to fight so much and have tantrums about this toy, I would just put the toy up high so the toddler could see it. You know what I mean? Don't just put it away. That's a mistake parents make. They just put it away. Well, your toddler will be distracted on to the next thing. If you want to teach a lesson, put the toy on the mantle where they can see it, but you are making it clear that until the behavior changes, you're not getting that toy.
Totally. And I think at home for us right now, the timer has also been our best friend because sometimes our 2-year-old, if we put her in a timeout and we say you're in a timeout for 2 minutes, she is distraught.
Right.
And sometimes it takes us sitting with her, even with her face to the wall. We have to sit with her for those whole 2 minutes while she's crying. So it feels sort of like it's defeating the purpose of the timeout if we're there. But, it's I love what you said. It's the boundary. She's staying there for her 2 minutes. But the love and commitment is that, we're there.
She feels the love and commitment. That's
right.
the mistake. She needs to know. And especially when you see your toddler getting into that ramped up hyperventilating, they cannot be comforted. If you put them so isolated, that's one reason why I kept timeouts in the space with all of us as opposed to go to the bathroom.
Right.
Because that makes them feel more isolated and disconnected. When you can have boundaries and consequences, but you're still present with them, that's a higher sense of safety and security there.
Absolutely. All right. We're going to close out this episode with a really controversial topic.
Oh, great. I love it.
Thoughts on spanking. So this question is, I grew up being spanked by my parents. I recently had a conversation with a good friend about how they spank their children. I'm not sure how I feel about it, honestly. I think I'm nervous that spanking would become too much of a reaction in the moment. Would love any thoughts.
This is like a whole episode.
Right.
So it's just easy to close out with this question. But, okay, my number one thought, and this is so important, anger is a huge problem in homes, Christian homes, non-Christian homes. Anger is the destroyer of relationships. So what I always say, if you have a problem with anger, you really, and I know a lot of people don't know that they have a problem with anger, so even in saying that, but if anger is a problem in your home, as a mom or a dad, you cannot spank your children. Mm-hmm. That's what I would say. You need to understand that you have to learn how to deal with your anger because anger at its core is actually the threat of violence. That's why anger works, and anger controls behavior, and that's why people default to it. So I don't like to ever talk about spanking without addressing anger. You cannot go near your child with any sort of spanking if you have an angry spirit or having a problem with anger. Okay, so that has to be said right up front. But when it comes to spanking, I believe it is a very important and biblical tool. It is clearly talked about in Scripture, has clearly been used throughout the ages. But just like anything else, it can be used well or it can be used poorly. Spanking in and of itself can be a very good biblical tool. One thing that would change for me is that I grew up in a home where, well, first of all, I didn't get many spankings because I had that personality, again, where they just had to look at me cross-eyed, and apparently I submitted. So I didn't have many spankings, but my parents spanked with their hand, okay? And I always thought that was the better way to do it. So I used to spank with a hand, and they used to spank like they would pull your pants down and spank. Mm-hmm. So that's the type of spankings I did have. And that's what I did at first, but I do feel that's not the biblical model. I began to realize that using a wood spoon, a rod, that's what the Bible talks about, spare the rod and spoil the child. And actually, that's the way my husband was raised, with a spanking using a wood spoon. But I would do it very, like, without any emotion, without any anger, take you guys into the bathroom on your clothes with the wood spoon. And it wasn't even very hard.
Right.
But what it taught me is that when I use that biblical model the way I believe it should be used, without emotion, without anger, it was extremely effective and important to understand, to teach them those really clear boundaries. So I feel like the very important thing for spanking with kids, too, is that they need to know when they've crossed the boundary that this type of consequence will be used. It was never used as first, it's a rebuke. It's a redirection. There's a rebuke. There might be a timeout. But if we're moving in that direction over and over, like, for example, RW bit other children.
Great.
Yeah, that was not the best. So he knew that if he bit one of his siblings, he was going to get a spanking. That's a clear, and that helped solve the behavior. I couldn't keep just gently redirecting him. No, you can't bite kids. But the guideline that always stuck with me came from Dr. Dobson. He said, if you are spanking your kids more, I think he even said more than once a day, then something's wrong. That's a guideline. You need to, again, go back to what are the boundaries I'm creating in my home that enable them to be successful.
Right.
And if I'm depending on spanking to control behavior, it means that my boundaries are not in the correct place.
I love that. Yeah, because I think that can be really hard when you feel like, okay, I'm running out of ideas. Like, I don't want to give 5 spankings in a day. Or like and something doesn't sit well as a mom when you're faced with that. But it's super helpful to like rewind a little bit and think, okay, how can I set my child up? No matter the age that they're in, how can I set them up for success in this area? So many good things. I feel like we could talk for an hour on discipline. But as we wrap up this first Q&A section, I know we are going to talk a little bit about some of the resources that we have. But today, can you talk really briefly about Not So Perfect Mom and how it can maybe apply to some of these things?
Not So Perfect Mom is a great foundational book for the relationship that you have with all of your children. And it will cover not just these toddler years, but older years as well. And I hope I wrote it in such a way that it even applies to a grandma can take things from that book. But the subtitle is Learning to Embrace What Matters Most. So it's about how to keep the relationship and the connection in the relationship is the priority in the parenting. I'm also going to add visionary parenting here because in visionary parenting, we talk about discipline, and I specifically talk about that difference between managed behavior and discipline, and we go into greater detail in that, plus discipline for teenage years as well. So I would say those 2 resources, Not So Perfect Mom and Visionary Parenting, are ones that would probably fill in this conversation very well. And those resources are available on our website, which is visionaryfam.com. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks, Lissy Bailey, for being here. It's such a delight to do this with my daughter, and we hope to see you next time on Family Vision.